Alhaitham was highly anticipated for months, was extremely popular when he first came out, and remains a fantastic choice as a DPS. So why does it feel like he rarely gets mentioned these days? Outside of combat, he's one of the most nuanced characters in the game. To this day, people have strong disagreements about him, particularly his relationship with Kaveh, and yet his story quest was one of the most disappointing in the entire game for me. No matter what he wants people to think, he is not just a Feeble Scholar. We got our first glimpse of the Sumeru cast in the third Sumeru preview trailer, Hoya of course giving us the tiniest of crumbs to slowly build excitement. Each character was on screen for just a few seconds with a mere sentence or two of description, so of course people pored over every single frame to learn as much as they could. While Nahida had already stolen my heart, the other character I was most intrigued by was Alhaitham, a mysterious and muscular man staring moodily off into the distance. His design is absolutely gorgeous, especially his flowing black and green cape thrown over one shoulder, and right from the start I planned to get him. As long as he didn't turn out to be an absolute asshole, of course. We didn't have long to wait before meeting him, and the depth and nuance to his character was a fantastic surprise and turned him into one of my favorites in the game. He shows up very early on in the Archon quests, quickly becomes a central character in the story, and ends up being the driving force behind the quest to save Sumeru. We get to know him very well through those events, but honestly what really took him to the next level for me were his two trailers which dropped just before he was made playable in version 3.4, which showcased two different sides to him. When we first meet him, he comes across as very direct and taciturn, uninterested in small talk and pleasantries, and always getting straight to business. After so many other characters who fawn over the traveler, this was a welcome change for me, though some people tend to interpret him as rude as a result. Over time, we see him interact with other people in Sumeru, and he's like this with everyone. He's blunt and factual, not because he's unkind, but because from his perspective, in a world where misunderstandings are inevitable, the right thing to do is strive for clarity and accuracy. He doesn't care what others think, and sees it as a waste of time trying to coddle their emotions, but he's not trying to hurt them either. He's a far cry from being the emotionless machine some people interpret him as. He also doesn't bow to people's expectations and rejects the position as Grand Sage, even though everyone else thinks he's insane for turning down such prestige. And even better, a lot of this comes through subtext, through the tone and emotions of the characters portrayed rather than explicitly stated. By the end of the Archon quest, I was sold. And then came the trailers. Alhaitham's teaser trailer is easily one of my favorites. It has gorgeous visual and wistful music and a voiceover which lets us into his inner world. Where many expected him to be rational and calculating, instead his inner voice is philosophical, waxing poetical about the search for knowledge and the heartbreaking fact that some answers will remain forever out of reach. His character demo is wildly different, and yet stands out as another one of my favorites. It shows the Sumeru gang gossiping about Alhaitham over some drinks and a game of cards, before he himself appears and joins the conversation, taking it completely in his stride and ending up monopolizing the discussion with a monologue about one of his special interests, leaving his friends exasperated. The interactions in this brief scene are brilliant, their playful banter and obvious affection for one another really bringing their unique characters to life. Exactly the kind of thing I wish we'd see more of in Genshin. I loved how these two trailers gave us a deeper insight into these wildly different sides of him. And then, the story quest turned out to be such a disappointment. It fell into that trap which I had hoped Hoya had learned to avoid, where some random new NPC takes center stage and drives the story, leaving the featured character on the sidelines in their own quest. It seemed like a story with potential, exploring themes of loss, control, and the nature of reality, but it fell completely flat for me because I didn't care for any of the characters. I'm just glad he was so present in Sumeru Archon quests and events, otherwise we would have missed out on so much depth. The character who knows him best is Kaveh. They were friends while they were students but had a falling out in the past, until eventually when Kaveh hit some serious financial troubles, Alhaitham invited him to move in, and they've lived together ever since. I adore Kaveh as well, and the interactions between the two of them give me life. To me, they come across as a pair of old friends who care deeply about one another, but who have wildly different communication styles which results in them having constant catty arguments about old disagreements. Where Alhaitham Alhaitham is logical and calculating, Kaveh is emotional and empathic, and the two rarely see eye to eye. Many would disagree and think they legitimately hate each other, but I think that ignores far too much of what goes between them. For example, while Alhaitham tends to explain his logic to others, he rarely does so when talking to Kaveh. Some think this is just him being mean, but I think it's actually because he sees Kaveh as his intellectual equal and assumes that he will keep up. There are many other examples along these lines, not least Alhaitham consistently dropping everything to help out Kaveh when he's in need. I'm not really into shipping culture, but these two are one of the rare cases where I really feel like it's hinted at for real, and I love it. Character-wise, I was completely sold. However, at the time, I was running low on Primo Gems, what else is new? And I was kind of hoping that I would dislike his playstyle so that I could skip him. So of course, he turned out to be one of my favorites. He's a Dendro sword user and he's main DPS with a flexible playstyle. His skill is like Kaching, or now Chiori's. You can tap it to dash towards the nearest enemy and hit them with Dendro damage, or you can hold it down to direct where you end up, including teleporting into the air. His burst is also very similar to Kaching's, causing multiple instances of Dendro damage with an area of effect. At first glance, many people considered him to be a lazy copy of Kaching with a new element tacked on. However, that's just the beginning. His kit centers around these green mirrors which you can see floating next to him. They're called chisel light mirrors, and he can have up to 3 of them at a time. When he has at least one mirror, his basic attacks are infused with Dendro damage, and he also gains coordinated attacks which are stronger the more mirrors he has. He also generates particles while performing his infused attacks. The mirrors then disappear one by one every 4 seconds. He gains a mirror in a number of situations. The simplest is that when he hits an opponent with a charged or plunging attack, he gains 1 mirror. When using his skill, if he has none to begin with, he gains 2. If he has 1 or more, then he gains only 1. His burst interaction with the mirrors is a little more complicated, however. If mirrors exist when it is cast, they are converted into extra burst damage hits. 2 seconds later, depending on how many mirrors the burst consumed, he will generate new mirrors. If he had none, he jumps straight to 3 mirrors. If he had 3, he gets none at all. If 1, he gets 2. If 2, he gets 1. If you haven't got the hang of playing as him, then all of this can sound overly complicated, but in a sense, it means he has 2 possible playstyles. First, he is absolutely brilliant when played as an on-field DPS, who is the central focus of the team. For this role, you first set up your buffs from all your supporting characters. You then switch to Alhaitham and start with his burst, which generates the maximum number of mirrors, and then start attacking using his Dendro-infused normal attacks. 4 seconds later, when 1 mirror disappears, you use his skill to regenerate that 3rd stack, and then continue attacking using his normal attacks. Another 4 seconds later, when another mirror disappears, you use his charged attack to again regenerate that 3rd stack, and then continue attacking using normal attacks. At this point, there are no more ways to generate stacks during this attack sequence, so what you do next depends on how long your support character's cooldowns are. Alhaitham's infusion will last a further 12 seconds at most, with his coordinated attacks getting weaker every 4. You can keep him on field attacking until your supports are ready, and you then start the rotation again. The main downside to this playstyle is that you cannot switch away to the other characters without losing the remainder of his infusion, which can be an annoyance in certain teams. For example, if you quickly kill all the enemies marked with Nahida's skill, you lose her damage contributions until his field time finally ends. It's also possible to play the same role while splitting his field time between 2 sections, using the burst to generate 3 stacks in one section, and then his skill and plunge and charge attack for the other section, though it requires a bit more conscious management than his simpler rotations. Either way, this playstyle is really fun and pretty much exclusively how I play him. Second, he can also work as a burst DPS who spends most of the rotation off-field but appears for a short duration to do a quick flash of damage. For this role, you can slot Alhaitham wherever makes most sense in the team's rotation. When you switch to him, you use his skill first, which grants you 2 mirrors. You then do either a charged attack or a plunging attack in order to get a 3rd, and then use his burst to consume all 3 mirrors and max out its damage. Since this means he does not get an infusion and his burst and skill are on cooldown, it's time to switch to different characters and continue your rotation. This is a playstyle which I have very rarely used, and which rarely gets mentioned at all. Most most of the time, when you want Dendro character in the team as a support, there are alternatives who are far more effective. Characters like Yaya, Baizu, Nahida, and so on, who provide Dendro application which lasts over time instead of being a single big burst, and also bring other things like buffs, healing, or shields. While this playstyle becomes more viable with his higher constellations, it feels like a bit of a waste of his strength. His burst has quite a long cooldown and therefore a high energy cost, so he's at best an awkward fit in burst-focused quick-swap teams. As for his build, he has unusual stat priorities, which change depending on the team he's in and the weapon he's holding. ER is generally the first priority depending on how often you want to use his burst, but after that, he's different to many other DPS characters. Since I usually play him in double Dendro teams alongside C1 Baizu, I aim for around 150 ER. His next priority stat is actually Elemental Mastery. It's best to aim for a minimum of 200 to 300 depending on the weapon before starting to build his other stats, though this does include team buffs, so his personal requirements can vary wildly depending on the team. After reaching the EM requirement, his damage scales fairly equally with crit, further EM, and attack stats, again slightly varying depending on team composition and your weapon choice. I ended up with around 1300 attack, a little over 400 EM, which rises to 500 EM through Dendro Resonance, and a fairly healthy crit ratio of 71 to 193. When in doubt, if you care enough to try to optimize your Alhaitham's build, the best thing to do is enter your artifacts and weapons into the Genshin optimizer and compare your different options. At first, I built him with his second best weapon, the Primordial Jade Cutter, since I had one spare. Eventually, after some absolutely cursed weapon banner pulls on his first rerun weapon banner, I got his signature weapon instead. Link in the description down below if you want to see me suffer. He would also be fantastic with a crit-focused 5-star, like Mid-Splitter, Haran, the Tranquil Waters, or even Freedom Sword with its fantastic EM stat and valuable passive. Either Battle Pass Sword, the Black Sword, or the Wolf Fang would work well for him. He also has several good free-to-play options, including the craftable Iron Sting, or the event swords Festering Desire or the Umbrella, if you happen to have them. He could also make great use of Sifo's Moonlight, Favonius, or even Sacrificial Sword in some situations. For his artifact stats, I went with EM, Dendro damage, and crit rate for his current build, though when he had the Jade Cutter, he had crit damage circled instead. He can also use an attack sense if the rest of the stats work out better that way, but it usually results in a noticeably weaker build. Technically, his ideal set is 4-piece Gilded Dreams, but it makes for an annoying experience when trying to put together a build because its passive does not apply when out of combat, and therefore the stats you see most of the time differ to what you see in battle. I kinda hate it. It also happens to be one of those times where I struggled to get a full set with decent substats, and since he's almost as strong with 2-piece sets, I ended up building him with mixed EM sets instead. This only marginally reduces his damage and is much easier to farm. He could also use 4-piece Deepwood, though usually it's better to give that set to one of the support characters instead. And when using 2-piece sets, he could also benefit from Dendro damage bonus as well. Finally, when it comes to talents, in the typical playstyle, his skill is the highest priority due to the strength of his coordinated attacks, his normal attacks come second, and his burst comes third. In my case, he was my first Triple Crown character. By far my favorite teams for Alhaitham are Catalyze teams, which focus on the trio of reactions between Electro and Dendro, Quicken, Spread, and Aggravate. My preferred lineup tends to be with 2 Dendro and 2 Electro characters in the team, depending on what kind of enemies I'm up against. For the second Dendro slot, Baizu is a particular favorite, though I sometimes bring along Nahida or Yao instead, and any other off-field Dendro applier would work too. The 2 Electro slots are a similar story. Any off-field applier works, so Fischl, Yamiko, Raiden, Beidou, and Kuki all get their time to shine. Dory could even be an option to help with energy recharge and healing. These teams can also have space for Anemo, Geo, and Cryo characters since these elements won't interfere with the reactions. Albedo, Sucrose, and C6 Diona are particularly valuable here since they provide an EM buff. Kazuha is pretty good due to the boost he provides to the Electro characters, and Zhongli would be great due to his resistance shred. Chiori would provide decent damage, though she's less useful than Albedo in this team due to his EM buff. Alhaitham is also a pretty great driver in Hyperbloom teams, though these tend to be more focused on the damage provided by the Hyperblooms themselves and therefore the Electro character's EM stat, with Alhaitham mostly being used to apply a ton of Dendro to the enemies. These teams generally have 2 Hydro characters, basically take your pick out of any off-field Hydro applier including Xingqiu, Yelan, Kokomi, Furina or even Ayato as a burst support, as C6 Candace is also a viable option, plus usually Cookie or Raiden with a full EM build to reliably trigger the Hyperblooms. These teams are strong and comfortable, but I have so many other Hyperbloom options that I tend to lean towards those instead. Quickbloom teams are a very interesting concept, existing halfway between Catalyze and Hyperbloom and bringing much of the benefits of both if you can pull it off. The trick for these teams is to bring more Dendro and less Hydro. This allows you to maintain the Dendro aura on the enemy, which lets you trigger both Bloom and Catalyze at the same time. Alhaitham excels in these teams. For example, Alhaitham with Yelan, Cookie and Nahida is incredibly powerful and very comfortable, while this one with Furina, Cookie and Baizu makes fantastic use of Furina's buff. Though again, I'm so comfortable with his Catalyzed teams that I rarely reach for Quickbloom. Alhaitham also works well in 2 other team setups. He's pretty good as an on-field Burgeon driver, for example alongside Toma and Xingqiu, though this isn't a team setup I've ever really experimented with. He's also well suited in Nilo Bloom teams, though I don't actually have her on my accounts, so I can't comment on how well it works. So why has he fallen out of the conversation? He still gets mentioned in some circles as a top tier DPS, but so much more focus goes to other characters. There are some factors which makes this pretty much inevitable, but they only tell part of the story. Abyss enemies change over time and Dendro has become a little less dominant, especially since Fontaine. New characters came along and take the spotlight and older ones get less attention even if they still remain strong. Alhaitham still deserves his reputation as one of the strongest characters, and in large part, he flies beneath the radar because of recency bias in popular content. But there's still one factor for him, which is a little different compared to the DPS characters who have debuted since his release: the strength of his constellations. Personally, I tend to stick to C0 for most characters and only rarely go for a C1 when they provide an extra skill cast or some similar quality of life improvement. Increased damage numbers appeal to me much less. However, there is a very vocal segment of the community who do prioritize damage above all else, and they're often the ones who go for higher constellations. In Alhaitham's case, I pulled more on his banner in the hopes of getting Yaoya and ended up with his C2, so he is my joint highest constellation limited 5-star. His cons are fairly balanced in my opinion. They each provide a decent boost, but nothing spectacular. He's already very strong at C0, so many people won't bother going further than that. This is very different to the DPS characters who have come out in recent times. Many, such as Neuvillette, Navia, Arlecchino, are similarly strong at C0 but become absolutely ludicrous when their cons are unlocked, and from that perspective, Alhaitham has definitely been left behind. While that's a valid viewpoint to have, and those people often kind of fund the game for the rest of us, it's a very different experience to what the vast majority of players are likely to have. For the rest of us, he really hasn't fallen behind and remains a fantastic and powerful DPS. All in all, Alhaitham is a fantastic character on every level and has playstyle which is at once powerful, familiar and unique. If you don't have him yet and you're looking out for a Dendro DPS, then definitely don't hesitate. He's absolutely worth it. Until next time!